A man's heart can split without a sound. His life can just go on, like nothing ever happened. That was the rancher's secret, his own private grief. Years ago, death had come for his sister, a girl only 10 years old, and the vast, empty prairie had swallowed the sound of his cries. He grew up into a man of hard silence, the kind of man who worked until his hands bled just to keep the memories from clawing their way out. Tonight, the wind was a predator, prowling the plains, rattling the loose boards of his barn like an animal testing the bars of a cage. He was working by the dim, flickering glow of a lantern, driving nails into a broken fence. Mending wood, he told himself, not the gaping hole in his chest. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, soft, quick footsteps crunching into the frozen ground, not the heavy, familiar rhythm of his cattle, not the sure tread of a horse and rider. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, and out of the swirling darkness, 2 small figures drifted into the lantern light. They were just children, a girl who looked about 8 and a younger one, maybe 5. They were barefoot in the snow, wrapped in thin, threadbare cloth that was no match for the biting cold. Their hair whipped wildly in the wind, and their eyes were huge, shining things carved from pure fear. They stopped at the edge of the light, hesitating, as if they couldn't decide whether to run from him or to him. But the cold had already made the choice for them. The rancher's voice, rough and cracked from disuse, slipped out. "Come inside." He didn't shout. He spoke low and steady, the way you'd soothe a spooked horse. They didn't answer. They just glanced at each other, a silent question passing between them, and then took a shuffling step forward. Their bare feet sank into the fresh snow. As he led them towards the cabin, he saw how the older one kept a fierce arm wrapped around the younger, pulling her sister tight against her side, a silent, desperate promise of protection. The gesture hit him like a physical blow, lodging in his chest like a shard of ice. Inside, the fire in the hearth was just a bed of smoldering embers. He stoked it back to life, and soon flames were leaping high, making shadows dance across the rough wooden walls. The children huddled near the fire, shivering uncontrollably as the first waves of warmth washed over them. Their faces were streaked with dirt, their lips chapped and cracked. He set a loaf of bread on the table and poured warm milk into 2 tin cups. The younger girl reached for it instantly, a raw, desperate need in her eyes. But the older one grabbed her hand, pulling it back. She was still watching him, cautious, wary of this stranger's kindness. The rancher understood. The world hadn't been kind to them. He knelt down, his knees creaking, and held out the bread. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard labor, but his offering was gentle. After a long moment, the older girl finally took it. She broke the loaf in 2 and gave the larger piece to her little sister. He watched them eat, a strange ache blooming deep inside him. It had been years since his cabin had heard small voices, years since it had known anything other than his own suffocating silence. Even though they were quiet, their presence filled the small room with a strange hum, like a half-remembered song from a long time ago. His mind drifted, unbidden, to his lost sister, to her smile, to the sound of her laughter. And for the first time in a very long time, the memory didn't feel like an open wound. It felt like a lantern, held up against the dark. Hours crawled by. The children, exhausted and finally warm, curled up on a quilt he'd laid before the fire. The younger one rested her head on her sister's chest, and their breathing soon softened into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. The rancher sat at his table, his rifle propped against the wall beside him. His eyes were fixed on the door. A storm was brewing in his mind, one that had nothing to do with the wind and snow outside. Who were these children? Where were their parents? To take them in for a night was one thing, but what if no one came looking for them? He felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing in on him from the darkness. The plains were never truly empty, and nothing, and no one, wandered out here without a reason. As if she'd heard his thoughts, the older girl stirred. She sat up, her movements slow and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice startled him. It was low and steady, carrying a strange dignity that seemed far too old for her small frame. "We were lost," she said, her dark, luminous eyes meeting his. "Our mother is looking. Our people are far." She was just a child, but she spoke with the solemn gravity of someone who had seen too much sorrow. He gave a single, slow nod. He understood the weight of words that were left unsaid. He understood secrets. Outside, a pack of coyotes began to howl, their cries sharp and brittle against the frozen night. He checked the load in his rifle and set it back within easy reach, even though he knew, deep in his bones, that it wasn't a coyote that had delivered these girls to his doorstep. The fire crackled, a log split, and a shower of sparks flew up the chimney. And in that moment, he realized something. By opening his door, by offering them bread and warmth, he had stepped onto a path, and there was no turning back. His solitude, which had been both his fortress and his curse for so long, had been breached. By two fragile souls who had asked for nothing, yet somehow demanded everything. Sleep was impossible. He sat bolt upright in his chair all night, listening to the soft sound of their breathing. Each rise and fall of their small chests was a tug on his heart, pulling him toward some long-forgotten tenderness. The night grew heavy and thick. The stars faded, and the snow kept falling, a soft, relentless blanket muffling the world outside his windows. He thought of the dawn and what it might bring. Help or more danger? Just as the horizon began to blush with the first faint hint of red, a shadow moved across the yard. A figure was walking through the snow, tall and unyielding, moving with a strange grace, as if the wind itself parted to let her pass. The children woke instantly, as if they had felt her presence. They sprang up from the quilt, their cries sharp with a mixture of relief and fear. They scrambled to the door and rushed outside, their small hands clutching at the skirts of the woman who had come. She was young, maybe 25 or 26, but she carried herself with the ancient gravity of the earth itself. Her face was etched with hardship, and her eyes were black pools of fire and grief. She knelt, embracing the girls, pulling them so close to her that her whole body trembled. Then she straightened up, her arms still protectively around her daughters, and turned her gaze on the rancher. Her look was not one of gratitude. It wasn't one of accusation either. It was something else entirely, something that felt like a brand, like a claim. Her words came slow, heavy, and undeniable. Each one landed like a stone in the silent morning air. "Now," she said, her voice as clear and cold as ice, "you belong to us." The rancher stood frozen, the cold morning air searing his lungs. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He didn't know if he had just been claimed, blessed, or cursed. Behind him, the fire in his hearth smoldered, its glow faint and weak against the endless white of the snow, as if it, too, was waiting to see which way the wind would turn. The sun climbed higher, spreading across the plains like a pale fire, turning the snow to gilded gold wherever it touched. But the rancher felt none of its warmth. He was rooted to the spot in his own yard, the woman's words echoing in his chest. "Now you belong to us." Her voice hadn't trembled. Her gaze hadn't wavered. She held her daughters as if she had personally wrestled them back from the jaws of death, and still had enough strength left over to claim him, too. He thought of his quiet years, of the silence he had built around himself, like a fortress wall, and for the first time, that wall felt impossibly fragile, as thin as frost on a window pane. The girls clung to their mother's skirts, their wide eyes flicking from her face to his, as if waiting to see what shape this strange new bond would take. He felt a bizarre mix of pride and deep, unsettling unease. He had saved them from the cold. He had given them bread and warmth, but he had never ever asked to be bound to them. Still, when the youngest girl reached a small hand out towards him before quickly hiding her face again in her mother's shawl, something deep inside him shifted. Some frozen river began to thaw. He led them inside, back to the fire, which was now a steady, comforting roar. The woman sat near the hearth, her movements efficient, yet tender as she untied the girls' shawls. She didn't thank him, not with words. Instead, her eyes moved around the small cabin, taking in every worn beam, every simple chair, every tool hanging by the wall. It felt like she was measuring the shape of the man who lived there. He felt stripped bare under her silent, assessing gaze. Later, when he went outside to chop more wood, he saw his neighbor, Amos, riding along the ridge. The old man's shoulders were stooped, his long beard white with frost. Amos dismounted, his pale eyes narrowing as he spotted the new figures moving inside the rancher's cabin. "You'd best send them on their way," Amos muttered, leaning in close, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Folks in town won't like it. And worse, some will call it danger. You don't want that kind of trouble, boy. You've had your share." The rancher's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, but he said nothing. He knew Amos's words were true. The world was a hard place, and people feared what they didn't understand. But the thought of turning this woman and her children back out into the snow burned in his chest like a betrayal. When he went back inside, the woman's dark eyes met his. She had heard every word. She didn't ask if he would listen to the old man. She didn't ask what he planned to do. She simply stated with that same quiet, unshakable strength that the moment he opened his door, he had stepped into their circle. Her people understood this truth, even if his did not. Survival wasn't a choice. It was a law that bound lives together. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue that he was a man who walked alone, but her next words silenced him. "You cannot feed a child, warm a child," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and then call yourself alone." That night, after the girls had once again curled into sleep by the fire, she told him pieces of her story. Her husband had been taken in a raid. Her people had been scattered like seeds in the wind. Some had gone to ground, hiding in the shadows. Some had simply gone to grief. She had searched for her daughters through storm and shadow until her feet were raw and bleeding, and now that she had found them, she would rather die than lose them again. Her eyes shone in the firelight, not with weakness, but with a fire that had been tempered and hardened by sorrow. He realized she was younger than he'd first thought, yet she carried a weight that would have broken stronger men. As he listened, something unexpected stirred in him. It wasn't pity. It was respect. In her silence, in her refusal to beg or to bow, he saw a strength he couldn't name. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who demanded recognition, who declared that belonging wasn't a gift to be given, but a law to be followed. The days passed in a fragile, unspoken truce. The girls played quietly on the floor with scraps of cloth he gave them, and the sound of their soft, infrequent laughter began to smooth the jagged edges of his solitude. But word traveled, the way it always did on the plains. Whispers slithered into town. Men muttered over their whiskey that the rancher had taken in strangers, that he was harboring enemies. One evening, he rode in for supplies and felt the heat of their stares on his back. Their voices rose around him in the general store, a chorus of warnings, mockery, and thinly veiled threats. "You'd better leave them to their own kind," the storekeeper said, not meeting his eyes. The rancher gripped the wooden counter until his knuckles turned white, holding back the storm of rage that was building inside him. Finally, he turned to face them all. "They're just children," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and a sudden terrifying fear of what he was tying himself to. "Nothing more, Night had fallen by the time he returned to the cabin. He pushed open the door and found them waiting for him by the fire. The woman rose slowly. Her daughters were already drifting off to sleep against the warm quilt. She looked at him with the steady, unyielding gaze of the plains themselves, and her words were soft, but they hit him with the force of a hammer. "You chose this," she said. "The moment you opened your door, the moment you fed them. You are not alone anymore." In that instant, the rancher felt the very ground shift beneath his feet, as if the land itself had turned over. He looked at her, and he didn't see a stranger anymore. He didn't even see a claimant. He saw a mirror. She had lost everything and had carried on. He had lost everything and had buried himself alive in silence. And now, here they both stood, before the same fire, bound together by two small children who had looked at him with trust in their eyes. His chest tightened with a fierce, painful emotion, a tangle of fear and longing so sharp it almost took his breath away. The feeling of belonging, he realized, could be salvation, and it could be ruin. Outside, the wind howled and shrieked against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire leapt higher, twisting their shadows into giants on the ceiling beams. The girls slept on, safe for now, their small, innocent breaths weaving the room into a sanctuary. The rancher sat across from the woman, the fire crackling between them, his hands restless, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the storm outside these walls was only the beginning. Tomorrow would demand more than just shelter. It would demand a choice that could cost him everything he had left, or give him back a life he thought he had lost forever. The fire cracked again, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Her eyes held his across the orange glow, steady as stone, unblinking, and he finally understood. Her words that first morning hadn't been a threat. They had been a promise. "Now you belong to us." And for the first time in more years than he could count, he was afraid, not of being claimed, but of what it might mean to finally accept it. He woke with a start. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The woman, Ilara, was already awake, watching him. There was something new in her eyes, a tension, a listening. "They're coming," she whispered. The words hung in the air, colder than the frost on the window. He was at the door in an instant, rifle in hand. Peering through a crack in the boards, he saw them. 3 riders on the horizon, dark silhouettes against the pale morning sky. They weren't riding fast. They were taking their time. They knew they had their prey cornered. "The Brand brothers," he breathed, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He'd heard the stories. Vicious men who worked for someone even more vicious. Someone who was rarely seen. A man they called the Piper. Ilara came to stand beside him. "They want what my husband had," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And what was that?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she went to her youngest daughter, who was still sleeping, and gently pried a small object from her hand. She brought it to the rancher. It was a small wooden bird, intricately carved, worn smooth with time. "This," she said. "This is a key." He stared at it. A key? It looked like a child's toy, but as he looked closer, he saw the strange, interlocking patterns carved into its wings. It wasn't just decorative. It was a code, a map. Suddenly, a memory, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of his grief. A memory he had buried for over a decade. He stumbled over to a dusty old chest in the corner, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the latch. He threw it open and dug past old tools and worn-out leather until his fingers closed around a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He brought it back to the firelight and unwrapped it. It was another wooden bird, identical to the one in Ilara's hand. His sister had been clutching it when they found her, all those years ago, frozen in the snow. They'd all assumed it was just a toy she'd found, a trinket she'd wandered too far to retrieve. But now, seeing its twin, a horrifying understanding began to dawn. "Where did you get this?" Ilara gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "My sister," he rasped, his throat tight. She followed a sound, a melody, out into a blizzard." Ilara's face went pale. "The Piper's song," she whispered. "My husband, he made a deal with him long ago, for protection. He carved 2 birds, one for each of our daughters, but the Piper betrayed him. He stole one of the birds and used its song to lure your sister away. He collects things, beautiful things, souls." The world tilted on its axis. The grief he had carried for years was suddenly transformed into a white-hot rage. His sister hadn't just been lost. She had been taken, murdered, by the same man who was now sending his dogs to this cabin, to these children. The riders were closer now. He could see their faces, hard, cruel men with dead eyes. "They won't get in," he said, his voice a low growl. "This stops here." He barred the door, wedged a heavy table against it, and moved to the windows, ramming shutters closed and plunging the cabin into a dim, fire-lit twilight. The girls were awake now, huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. Ilara grabbed an old iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white. This was no longer just about sheltering strangers. This was about vengeance. This was about rewriting the ending to a story that had haunted him his entire life. He had opened his door to 2 lost children, and in doing so, he had opened a door into his own past. And now, the monster from that past was outside, knocking. A voice boomed from the yard, rough and impatient. "We know you're in there, rancher. Send out the woman and her brats. The Piper just wants what's his. Don't have to be no trouble." The rancher lifted his rifle, the cold metal a comfort against his cheek. He aimed at the center of the wooden door. "There's already trouble," he muttered, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed like a clap of thunder, splintering the thick wood of the door. Outside, there was a curse, then silence. The siege had begun. They were trapped, a tiny island in a sea of malice, with the ghosts of the past and the monsters of the present circling in the snow. The Brand brothers weren't expecting a fight. They were used to terrorizing unarmed families, not a man with nothing left to lose. For hours, it was a stalemate. They would try the windows, and he would fire a warning shot. They would yell threats, and he would answer with the cold, hard silence of his rifle. The cabin was a fortress, but they all knew it couldn't last forever. They were running low on ammunition, and the Brands were patient. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow outside in shades of blood and violet, a new voice called out. A familiar voice. "Son, don't be a fool. Just give them what they want." The rancher froze. He moved to the crack in the wall and peered out. It was Amos, his neighbor. The old man was standing with the Brand brothers, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of fear. "Amos?" The rancher called out, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing?" "The Piper. He sees everything, boy," Amos cried, his voice trembling. "He promised no one else would get hurt if you just cooperate. Don't you understand? Your fight ain't with these men. It's with him, and you can't win that fight." The betrayal was a physical blow, worse than any bullet. Amos, the man who'd offered him quiet condolences after his sister's death, the man who'd shared a drink with him on lonely winter nights. He hadn't been a friend, he'd been a spy, an informant, the Piper's eyes and ears on this stretch of empty land. "What do the birds do?" the rancher asked, turning to Ilara, his voice flat and dead. "Why does he want them so badly?" "They are the keys to the still heart," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. "A hidden place, a sanctuary my people made long ago. When the 2 birds are brought to the gate, they can seal it forever, hiding it from the outside world. My husband meant to take our people there, to save them, but the Piper wants it for himself, a kingdom built in shadow. A plan began to form in the rancher's mind, a desperate, crazy plan. He knew this land better than anyone. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its forgotten places. "There's a storm cellar," he said, thinking fast. "Under the barn. It connects to an old creek bed. It's dry this time of year. It'll take us towards the canyons." "Where the still heart is hidden," Alara finished, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of hope. It was their only chance. A mad dash through enemy territory, under the cover of darkness. He explained the plan. He would create a diversion at the front of the cabin. While the Brands were focused on him, she would take the girls out the back, through a small trapdoor beneath a loose floorboard he'd always meant to fix. They would run for the barn, for the cellar, for the creek bed. "I'll hold them off," he said. "Then I'll follow you." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "You are one of us now," she said, and this time it sounded like a prayer. "Do not be left behind." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He looked at the two little girls, their faces pale in the firelight. He saw his own sister's face superimposed over theirs. He wasn't just saving them, he was saving her, too. Finally. He waited until the moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. He took a deep breath, kicked over a lantern near the front window, and the dry curtains went up in an instant blaze. Flames licked up the walls, pouring smoke and light out into the yard. "Fire!" one of the brothers yelled. It was the diversion they needed. As the Brands rushed the front of the burning cabin, Alara lifted the floorboard. A gust of cold, earthy air rushed up. One by one, she lowered the girls into the darkness, then slipped down after them, the two wooden birds clutched in her hand. The rancher waited, his heart pounding. He counted to 100. Then, covering his face with his arm, he ran through the smoke-filled room and out the back door, disappearing into the chaos of the night. The prairie that had been his prison was now his only hope for escape. The freezing air hit him like a hammer, but it cleared his head. The barn was 100 yards away, a dark monolith against the flickering orange glow of the burning cabin. He ran, keeping low, his boots crunching on the snow. He could hear the Brands shouting, confused by the fire, their attention split. He'd bought Alara and the girls a few precious minutes. He hoped it was enough. He reached the barn, his lungs burning, and slipped inside. The familiar smells of hay and leather filled his senses. He moved silently to the back, to the heavy wooden doors of the storm cellar set into the dirt floor. He pulled them open. Darkness. "Alara?" he whispered. A hand reached up and grabbed his. "We are here," she breathed. He scrambled down into the cramped, musty space, pulling the doors shut, just as he heard the barn doors creak open. The heavy footsteps of the Brand brothers echoed on the floorboards above them. They were searching. They held their breath, packed together in the cold earth. The youngest girl started to whimper, and Alara pressed the child's face into her shoulder, muffling the sound. Above them, the footsteps paused. The rancher's heart stopped. Had they heard? A tense, unbearable silence stretched on. Then, with a curse, the footsteps moved away, and the barn doors slammed shut. They were safe, for now. Using a small tinderbox, the rancher lit a tiny stub of a candle. In the wavering light, he saw the entrance to the tunnel, a low, narrow opening at the far end of the cellar. It was barely big enough to crawl through. "It leads to the creek bed," he whispered. "It's a half-mile crawl, maybe more. We have to go now." He went first, the rifle pushed ahead of him. The tunnel was tight, claustrophobic. The air was stale and cold, dirt and pebbles rained down on them. Behind him, he could hear Alara murmuring encouragement to the girls, her voice a steady, calming presence in the terrifying dark. It felt like they were being buried alive, inching their way through the guts of the earth. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A faint circle of gray light ahead. the exit. They emerged, gasping, into the bottom of the frozen creek bed. The steep, rocky walls on either side offered them cover. They were exposed, but hidden from direct sight of the cabin. But their relief was short-lived. A chilling sound drifted down from the ridge above them, a high, thin, haunting melody. The piper's song. He was here. The real monster had come to join the hunt. "He knows," Alara whispered, her face ashen. "He knows where we are going." The song seemed to get inside the rancher's head, pulling at the frayed edges of his sanity. It was the same tune that had haunted his nightmares for years, the melody that had led his sister to her death. He fought against it, focusing on the anger, the raw need for vengeance that had been simmering for over a decade. "Faster," he urged, and they began to run, stumbling over the icy rocks in the creek bed. The canyons were close. He could see their dark mouths gaping in the distance. The entrance to the Still Heart had to be there. They scrambled out of the creek bed and started across the last open stretch of plain. And that's when the Brand brothers appeared, riding hard to cut them off. They'd been led here by the piper's song. There was no more running, no more hiding. "Take the girls!" the rancher yelled to Alara, shoving the second wooden bird into her hands. "Get to the entrance! Don't stop for anything!" She didn't argue. She scooped up the younger girl, grabbed the older one by the hand, and ran towards the canyons as fast as her legs could carry her. The rancher turned to face the three riders. One man against three. His rifle had 3 shots left. He made them count. He aimed for the horses, not the men. A horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider. Another veered off, panicked. The third brother charged forward, drawing his pistol. The rancher dropped his empty rifle and pulled the heavy hunting knife from his belt. The man fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of the rancher's shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain. He roared and lunged forward, tackling the man off his horse. They hit the frozen ground with a brutal thud. It was a desperate, ugly fight. No skill, just raw fury. The rancher felt fists and boots crashing into him, but his own pain was a distant thing. All he saw was his sister's face. All he felt was the rage of a man who had finally been woken up. He fought with the strength of a cornered animal, using the land he knew so well to his advantage. He kicked, he gouged, he fought like the prairie itself, harsh, unforgiving, and relentless. He disabled one brother, then another, until only one was left standing, bleeding and broken. But as he looked up, past the defeated men, he saw a new figure walking calmly towards him through the snow. A tall, gaunt man in a long black coat. His face was pale and thin, and his eyes burned with a cold, dead light. The piper. He wasn't looking at the rancher. His gaze was fixed on the canyon, where Alara and the girls had just disappeared into a narrow crevice. "She carried her grief like a shield," the piper said, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "Just as you carried yours. Such beautiful, useless things. I took your sister's song, you know. It was very sweet. Faded quickly, though." The taunt was designed to break him, but it did the opposite. It focused all his pain, all his grief, all his rage into a single burning point. He got to his feet, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and began to walk towards the piper. "This ends," the rancher said, his voice a low growl. The piper smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his pale face. "Yes," he said, "it does." He started walking towards the canyon, confident that the rancher was too broken to stop him. But he underestimated the man who had nothing to lose. The rancher charged, a guttural roar tearing from his throat, and slammed into the piper with the force of a freight train. They tumbled together towards the narrow crevice Alara and the girls had entered. Inside the crevice, a low humming sound had started. The air grew thick, shimmering like a heat haze. Alara was placing the 2 wooden birds into twin hollows in the rock face. The gate to the Still Heart was closing. The rancher saw his chance. It was the only way, to end it for good. He grappled with the piper, who was unnaturally strong, his thin arms like bands of steel. They staggered right to the edge of the shimmering gateway. The humming grew louder, the light more intense. "You cannot stop me!" the piper shrieked, his composure finally breaking. "That world is mine!" "Then you can have it!" the rancher bellowed. With one final, desperate surge of strength, born of a lifetime of grief, he shoved the piper forward. The dark figure stumbled through the shimmering curtain of light just as it began to collapse inward. The piper let out a final, frustrated scream as the rock face sealed behind him, becoming solid, seamless stone. The humming stopped. The haunting melody was gone. Silence. The prairie was utterly still. The Brand brothers, their leader vanished, their will broken, staggered to their feet, and fled into the dawning light. The rancher stood alone, bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, in the quiet of the new day. A small stone panel slid open, and Alara stepped out, the girls right behind her. The threat was gone. The monster was caged. The past was finally at rest. She came to him, her eyes shining with tears. She reached out and gently touched the wound on his shoulder. "You opened your door," she said, her voice soft. Not a command, not a claim, but a simple statement of fact. "This is your home now. We are your people." He looked past her, at the two small girls who were no longer staring at him with fear, but with a quiet, trusting awe. For the first time, the vast, empty silence of the prairie didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. He looked out at the rising sun, a new family by his side, the weight in his chest finally, miraculously, gone. A man's heart can split without a sound, but sometimes, if he's lucky, it can be mended just the same way. What would you have done if those children showed up at your door? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because there are always more shadows lurking on the plains.